On the evening of April 14, 1912, the Titanic, a colossal cruise liner measuring 882 feet long, glided across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a freezing cold night, and though the crew were aware of icebergs in the area, they didn't reduce the ship's speed. Instead, they chose to race on at a pace of 22 knots until, at 11:40 p.m., an almighty crack was heard on the Titanic's starboard side. The supership had been stopped in its tracks by a colossal iceberg. The enormous chunk of ice carved a 300-foot gash into the vast vessel, leading water to pour in at a rate of 7.1 tons per second. Despite that, the 2,240 on board weren't concerned. After all, the Titanic had been declared unsinkable. The ship could reportedly stay afloat if as many as 4 compartments were breached. However, on this occasion, 6 compartments were ruptured. If that wasn't bad enough, the Titanic only had 20 lifeboats, accommodating 1,178 people, barely half the ship's capacity. That's despite the Titanic's original design housing 64 lifeboats, enough to hold all the passengers on board. However, the ship's owners cut the number down, as they felt too many lifeboats would clutter the deck and obscure the first-class passengers' view. If that wasn't negligent enough, the 20 lifeboats they did have weren't even filled properly. Officers didn't know how many people could safely be carried in the lifeboats, so they erred on the side of caution, costing at least 500 more lives. Those that weren't taken down with the ship were claimed by the icy cold water. The sudden immersion into the freezing Atlantic was the end for many, passing from cardiac arrest or hypothermia within 15 minutes. Horrifically, just 712, or a mere 32% of those on board, survived the unsinkable ship's sinking. And yet, disastrous as the Titanic's demise was, there are some lesser-known shipwrecks from history that are far, far more tragic. Intrigued? Then, join me, as we dive down to discover some shipwrecks that were even worse than the Titanic. In late 1948, a fierce civil war was raging in China, with communist forces beginning to seize power in large parts of the country. In response, thousands fled the nationalist stronghold of Shanghai before communist forces arrived. Their savior? The SS Qianjia. On December 4, 1948, she set off, officially carrying 2,150 refugees, nearly double her capacity. In reality, several thousand more had crowded onto the steamer before it left the dock. Initially, things were going as smoothly as they could on the jam-packed vessel. However, 50 miles south of Shanghai in the mouth of the Huangpu River, disaster struck, literally. The steamship was suddenly rocked by a large explosion towards the stern, suspected to be a Japanese naval mine left from World War II. Due to the shallowness of the river, the ship didn't sink entirely. The hull settled upright on the riverbed, with what was left of the upper deck remaining above water. Unfortunately, anyone that survived the blast quickly met their end as water flooded through the rest of the ship. Crucially, the radio room, which was also on the lower decks, became flooded too, putting it out of action before a distress call could be made. 3 hours later, distress flares that survivors sent up were spotted. Numerous small boats came to the rescue. But by this point, there were sadly very few survivors. Whether taken by the blast, the ship's sinking, or the effects of hypothermia, the Qianjia shipwreck is estimated to have lost close to 3 times as many passengers as the Titanic. In all, as many as 3,920 sadly perished, making the Qianjia China's worst maritime disaster. In December 1987, passengers in the Philippines were clambering onto the ferry MV Dona Paz, excited to head home for the holidays. The 305-foot-long ferry was authorized to carry 1,518 passengers, yet bribed officials led about 4,400 people onto the seriously overcrowded vessel. At 6:30 a.m. on December 20, Dona Paz left the island of Leyte, expecting to arrive at Manila at 4 a.m. the next day. Regardless of the claustrophobic conditions, the journey was smooth. And, as night fell, most of the passengers slept. They'd soon be woken, though. Around 10:30 p.m., the Dona Paz collided with another ship, the MT Vector. Despite clear visibility and calm seas, neither ship gave any indication it was aware of the other. It was later revealed that the Dona Paz's captain was watching a movie, while officers were drinking beer in the crew's recreation quarters. To top it off, neither ship had a working radio. That'd be a big mistake, considering the MT Vector wasn't any old ship but a 170-foot-long oil tanker carrying over 1,000 tons of gasoline products. As the ships collided, the MT Vector's cargo ignited, causing an explosion and a fire that rapidly spread to the Dona Paz. Many were taken by the initial explosion, but the chances for those who'd survived the blast weren't good either. The oil-slicked waters were ablaze with fire from the explosion. Even worse, life jackets on the Dona Paz had been locked away. Anyone left alive had to risk plunging into the flaming waters, with nothing to keep them afloat. Around an hour after the collision, a passing ship spotted the flaming vessels and helped 26 survivors to safety. That's right, just 26 survived out of the original 4,400 or so on board. In all, this shocking shipwreck claimed some 2,800 more fatalities than the Titanic, in what is now known as the world's worst peacetime maritime disaster. It was a naval evacuation plan, transporting German troops and civilians from Eastern Europe back to Germany. By January 1945, hundreds of thousands of German refugees streamed into the port of modern-day Gdynia in Poland, hoping to secure a place on the Wilhelm Gustloff, a giant 684-foot-long military transport ship. On January 30, the ship set sail for Kiel in northern Germany. She had a 1,465-person capacity, but on this day she was carrying, hang on. That can't be right. 10,000? My God, sources all estimate some 10,000 passengers were on board, putting her more than 6.5 times over capacity. Unbeknownst to all those on board, though, an S-13 Soviet submarine was stalking the ship underwater. At 9 p.m. that night, the submarine fired 3 torpedoes, striking the Wilhelm Gustloff on the stern, bow, and center. Those who survived the initial impacts rushed to the deck to avoid the rising water, but most of the lifeboats were frozen to the side of the ship. If that wasn't hellish enough, the Wilhelm Gustloff soon began to list, sinking towards the port side, making the lifeboats on the starboard side inaccessible. In the end, just 9 lifeboats could be lowered before the ship sank, leading the vast majority of survivors to jump into the icy Baltic Sea. Sadly, they wouldn't be survivors for long. The water temperatures dropped below 39 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning they'd lose consciousness in mere minutes. Anyone lucky enough to land a lifeboat was picked up by rescue vessels. But there were so few. By the time rescue attempts were called off, there were only around 1,200 survivors. Tragically, the Wilhelm Gustloff had close to 6 times the number of casualties as the Titanic, with some 9,000 passengers meeting their end in the Baltic Sea. Man, that's one sizable shipwreck. In September 2002, La Jula, a modest 260-foot-long ferry, set off from the port of Ziguinchor in southern Senegal, West Africa, to the capital Dakar in the north. Usually, La Jula would make the 300-mile trip twice a week. However, by 2002, the ship had been out of service for almost a year, undergoing repairs on its portside engine. By the end of 2002, La Jula returned to service, but she was only capable of making 1 trip per week so the new port engine could be run improperly. But this single weekly trip led to a huge demand for tickets. When La Jula set sail again on September 26, she was carrying 1,863 passengers, more than triple her 580-person capacity. The vessel was so overcrowded, people reported her listing as she left the port. Despite all that, there was a good atmosphere on board. That was until 11 p.m. when La Jula sailed into a storm halfway into her journey. Normally, she would have withstood the weather, but the ship was hopelessly top-heavy, with many passengers sleeping on the upper deck. Just 5 minutes after sailing into the storm, La Jula rolled over, with the bottom of the boat poking above the water's surface. Many survived the initial capsizing but were horrifyingly trapped in tiny air pockets in the upturned ship. To their despair, help wasn't on the way. The crew were caught off guard by how quickly the ship tipped, so no rescue message was sent. It wasn't until one of the survivors released flares into the sky that small fishing boats came to help. While these pulled some survivors from the water, government rescue teams didn't arrive at the scene until the following morning. Even when they arrived, there was nothing they could do to rescue those stuck under the upturned ship. 16 hours after La Jula capsized, she sank completely. Regrettably, just 64 out of La Jula's 1,863 passengers lived to tell the tale of Africa's deadliest shipwreck. In the years after the Titanic disaster, stricter laws were put in place to ensure greater protection for those traveling at sea. The Federal Seamen's Act, for example, was passed in 1915 and required passenger vessels to hold more lifeboats. One such vessel was the SS Eastland, a 265-foot passenger ship known as the Speed Queen of the Great Lakes. But what she had in speed and style, she lacked in practicality, being top-heavy and unstable. Ironically, the Federal Seamen's Act only worsened the Eastland's stability. Despite being designed to carry 6 lifeboats, she now held 11, as well as 37 life rafts and around 2,500 life jackets, most of which were stowed on the ship's upper deck. Experts warned that adding extra weight to an already wobbly vessel would cause it to capsize. And, predictably, their fears came true on the fateful morning of July 24, 1915. The Eastland was tied to a dock on the Chicago River, filling up with employees of an electron tube company on their way to a work picnic. At 6:41 a.m., while the vessel was still tied to the dock, it began listing to the starboard side. Panicked, the crew let water into the ship's ballast tanks to try and balance her out. Although righted, the Eastland soon began listing to the port side, eventually tipping down 25 degrees. Just minutes later, the vessel had completely rolled onto its side. Those on the upper decks were able to clamber over the starboard railing and walk across the hull to safety, while others were flung into the water. Those below deck were less fortunate. Some were injured by heavy furniture that slid across the tilted decks, others failed to escape the ship as water gushed in. Of the 2,500 on board, 844 passengers and crew sadly perished, with most meeting their end just feet away from the shoreline, making the Eastland one of the cruelest shipwrecks in history. Who knew lifeboats could be so deadly? 800 years before the Eastland shipwreck, the White Ship, a vessel resembling a Viking longship, was setting sail across the English Channel, transporting English nobles from France to England. Thomas Fitzstephen, the ship's captain, offered his vessel to the King of England, Henry I, but he'd already made other arrangements. Instead, the king allowed his entourage, including his heir, William Adelin, to board the White Ship. While crossing the choppy Channel waters, excited revelers on board ordered Fitzstephen to overtake the king's ship. In fairness, the White Ship was fast and considered the best in its class, making the captain and crew extremely confident they'd reach England first. But that confidence didn't last long. While zipping across the Channel in the dark of night, the White Ship's portside struck a submerged rock off the coast of Barfla in Normandy, capsizing the vessel. All but one of its 300-odd crew sank down into the depths of the Channel with it. Among those was William Adelin. Yep, the heir to the English throne. Not only was Adelin's passing a personal tragedy for the king, but it also unleashed chaos in his kingdom. When Henry passed away 15 years later, the lack of a rightful heir led to a civil war, as claimants tried to bully their way to power. Chroniclers of the time reveal that, in addition to those lost in battle, thousands starved as a result of the unrest. And to think, all that could have been avoided if some nobles didn't think they were playing Need for Speed. Great, now, what shocking shipwreck have we got next?